Iron Israel, Iron Dome, unable to stop Iranian rockets. There was a promise. It was forged in steel and algorithm built on years of American funding and cutting-edge Israeli engineering, sold to the entire world as the definitive answer to the question that has haunted Israel since its founding. How can a small country surrounded by enemies guarantee the security of its population against adversaries who outnumber it in projectiles and in determination? This promise had a name that sounded like a celestial shield, the Iron Dome. And for years, that name functioned as a talisman invoked in international security conferences, cited in military academy textbooks across the Western world. Its spectacular nighttime images broadcast globally. Those luminous trails rising toward the dark sky of Tel Aviv to intercept projectiles in flight. Those small white explosions at 500-meter altitude that transformed death into reassuring fireworks. Israel was protected, the shield held, and the world watching these images believed that technology had definitively solved the ancient problem of a besieged country. On March 11, 2026, that belief shattered against a reality that Iran and its allies had patiently prepared for 2 decades. Hey everyone, I'm Michael Harris, geopolitical and military analyst, and you're watching my channel. What I'm about to share with you reveals the collapse of the myth that has underpinned Israeli security doctrine for over a decade. The Iron Dome, the most celebrated, most financed, and most praised defensive system in contemporary military history, has been exposed as inadequate against the coordinated assault that Iran and Hezbollah have unleashed. This is not Iranian propaganda speaking. This is the Israeli Defense Forces themselves, confirming to major American newspapers that half of the rockets fired at Israel are getting through. Before we examine how the shield that was supposed to be impenetrable has proven to be anything but hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, drop a comment with your thoughts as we go through this together, and share this video with everyone who needs to understand why the strategic calculations in the Middle East have fundamentally changed. Now let's examine how Iran exposed the limits of Israel's celebrated defense. On the 13th day of a war that nobody had predicted in its duration or intensity, 100 rockets left Lebanese soil simultaneously, a single coordinated salvo directed at northern Israel. Less than an hour later, according to an exclusive source from the Israeli Defense Forces cited by the New York Post, approximately 50 of these rockets had reached their targets without being intercepted. 50% failure rate. Half of a salvo of 100 rockets passed through the most celebrated, most financed, and most praised shield in contemporary military history. This figure, this brutal and indisputable fraction, had the effect of an earthquake in strategic circles that had built their vision of the Middle East on the conviction that the Iron Dome rendered Israel structurally invulnerable to rocket attacks. This is not an Iranian source making this claim. This is not TAN propaganda. This is the Israeli military itself confirming to a major American newspaper that half of Hezbollah's rockets had penetrated its defenses. The images that began circulating in the hours that followed were extraordinary, and this quality of extraordinary deserves attention. Israel possesses one of the strictest military censorship policies in the world. It is extremely rare to obtain video sequences showing rocket impacts on Israeli territory, images of damage caused in residential areas, views of multiple simultaneous trajectories in the sky of northern Israel. If these images filtered through, it is partly because Israeli authorities need to show them to justify the response to Lebanon they are already planning and to prepare public opinion for what comes next. But even within this logic of calculated communication, the reality these images reveal exceeds what official communicates can dress up. One sees rocket trails crossing the sky without being intercepted. One sees impacts. One sees northern Israel under a rain that the Iron Dome was supposed to never let pass. To understand why 50 rockets out of 100 succeeded in penetrating the system, one must return to the very conception of the Iron Dome and the limits that its engineers knew perfectly well. But that official communication never found useful to detail publicly. The Iron Dome was developed by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in the second half of the 2000s with substantial American funding in response to a very specific problem, the Qassam rockets of Hamas. Those metal tubes filled with artisol explosives that fighters could assemble in a basement and that fell in the streets of Ashkelon and Sderot, killing Israeli civilians while conventional defenses could do nothing. Against this specific threat, the system demonstrates remarkable effectiveness. Its radar detects incoming projectiles. Its combat software calculates within seconds whether the trajectory threatens a populated area or will simply strike agricultural land. And it intercepts only what represents a real danger to valuable targets. This logic of intelligence selection is what makes the Iron Dome an economically viable system where systematic interception would be ruinously expensive. And this architecture of selection, which constitutes its strength in the scenario for which it was designed, becomes precisely its vulnerability in the scenario that Iran and Hezbollah have imposed upon it. The Iron Dome batteries have a rate of fire. The radars have processing capacity. The software must prioritize, calculate, and make decisions in real time. When presented with 100 rockets simultaneously from multiple directions with varied trajectories, some high and slow, others low and fast, some mimicking the trajectory of a strike on a populated zone and others not. The system begins to run out of available interceptors, calculation cycles, and physical response capacity. This is not a design flaw. It is a mathematical and physical limit that any honest engineer could calculate on paper. Saturation is not a Hezbollah improvisation. It is a doctrine elaborated over years of patient observation, testing, and meticulous recalibration integrated long ago into the military planning of the axis of resistance. What makes the attack of March 11th particularly significant in the context of this war is that Hezbollah was not supposed to be capable of such a demonstration. The dominant narrative circulating in Israeli military circles and in the media that relay them with complacency presented the Hezbollah of 2026 as a decapitated, traumatized organization whose offensive capabilities had been severely degraded after a series of spectacular Israeli operations. The most emblematic of these operations, the beeper attack of 2024, had targeted communication devices used by the organization's cadres, killing and mutilating hundreds of members in what had been presented as a technological masterstroke. Hassan Nasrallah himself had been eliminated in a bombardment of his headquarters in Beirut. The Hezbollah leadership had been decimated. The communiques of the Israeli army boasted of this. And yet, on March 11th, 100 rockets simultaneously left Lebanese soil, half penetrated the Iron Dome, and the damage caused in Israel was serious enough that Tel Aviv immediately began planning a ground invasion of Lebanon. Haaretz, the Israeli daily that remains the most serious on security questions and the least inclined to triumphist propaganda, published on March 11th itself an analytical article that merits attention. It discusses, with cautious language but unusual frankness in this context, a hole in Israel's early warning system. The article explains something that the public defenders of the Iron Dome prefer not to mention. Missile defense systems themselves need to be protected. The Iron Dome batteries, the David Sling systems, the arrow launchers, and above all, the radars that feed the entire apparatus. All these installations are physical targets. They are visible by commercial satellite. They have fixed or semi-fixed locations that can be mapped, and a strategy that consists of degrading them by striking directly rather than seeking to saturate them from the air is strategically just as valid, indeed more effective and less costly than pure saturation. Iran understood this well before February 28, 2026. From the first hours of Operation Honest Promise 4, the Iranian response to Operation Epic Fury, the Revolutionary Guards targeted radars, communication systems between batteries, and missile defense installations before even beginning their massive salvo of ballistic missiles. This sequence is not a coincidence. It is the operational translation of a doctrine built on years of patient intelligence gathering. Degrade the defenses first, then strike with waves that exploit the holes created. The result of this strategy was severe enough to force the United States to urgently repatriate a THAAD battery from South Korea to compensate for damage sustained by systems already deployed in the region. THAAD Terminal High Altitude Area Defense is the upper tier of American missile defense architecture in the Gulf. Moving it from the Korean Peninsula during an active conflict is not a decision taken lightly. It says implicitly that losses on defensive systems in place were significant enough to create a capacity emergency that the Pentagon could not ignore. This same logic of preliminary degradation applied by Iran from day one was reproduced by Hezbollah on March 11th in the form of saturation. Together, the two strategies complement each other with a precision that speaks of coordination that many had refused to acknowledge. While Iran wears down defensive batteries through targeted strikes on their components, Hezbollah saturates them from a different direction, from the north. While Iranian waves continue from the east, Israel finds itself forced to defend simultaneously on two fronts, with defense systems that have already sustained damage with interceptor stocks that are depleting faster than they can be reconstituted, and with warning times that, according to Haaretz, have fallen below 10 minutes in certain zones, insufficient to permit either reliable interception or even orderly evacuation of civilians toward shelters. The numerical data published by the Jerusalem Post after 11 days of combat gives concrete reality to what might be tempting to reduce to a strategist's quarrel. 9,000 claims for damage filed with Israeli authorities, 6,500 buildings damaged, 14 on 40 declarations for equipment and contents, 1,485 vehicles destroyed. These figures, still incomplete because they predate the Hezbollah salvo of March 11th, paint the portrait of a country absorbing real measurable damage accounted for in the ordinary lives of its inhabitants. Houses, cars, businesses, apartments. These 9,000 families are not war statistics. They are people who filed a form because their daily life was physically touched, despite the most famous shield in the contemporary military world. The significance of the Hezbollah attack exceeds, however, the simple arithmetic of failed interceptions. It says something fundamental about the limits of the Israeli approach that consists of believing that eliminating leaders suffices to destroy an organization. Hezbollah is not a conventional army whose chain of command is so centralized that the death of the chief provokes operational paralysis. It is a diffuse, decentralized structure rooted in entire communities that depend on its social, health, and economic network as much as its military one. Cutting the head of this organization does not stop the rest of the body if the body was designed from the origin to function without a central head. Hezbollah's launch ramps are dispersed in villages, cellars, tunnels dug over decades in the subsoil of southern Lebanon. Neither the near daily strikes by the Israeli Air Force on identified positions, nor the Beeper attack, nor the death of Nasrallah destroyed this firing infrastructure. It waited patiently, and on March 11th it responded with 100 simultaneous rockets. An organization that decades of conflict have made profoundly pragmatic like Hezbollah did not engage on March 11th out of ideology or warlike enthusiasm. It calculated its own survival with cold lucidity. If Iran is crushed as a regional power by this war, Hezbollah loses its principal thunder, its arms supplier, its strategic protector, and the raison d'être of a large part of its geopolitical positioning. A defeated Iran means an isolated Hezbollah deprived of resources, exposed to Israeli vengeance, without a military supply chain, and without a diplomatic umbrella. Facing this scenario, Hezbollah's logic was of implacable clarity. It is better to fight now alongside an Iran still standing and still capable of striking than to wait to be methodically weakened and finally eliminated alone after Iranian power has been reduced to nothing. This is not a logic of martyrdom. It is a logic of survival. And the analysts who had predicted that Hezbollah would stay out of the conflict to avoid Israeli retaliation had underestimated to what degree its destiny was linked to that of Iran. The economic question of this defensive conflict is the one that strategists prefer not to pose too loudly because its implications are uncomfortable. Each Iron Dome interceptor costs between $40,000 and $100,000 depending on its version. Each Patriot PAC-3 interceptor costs between $2 and $4 million. Each Arrow 3 interceptor costs between $2 and $3 million. On the other side, a Hezbollah rocket of the Katyusha type costs a few thousand. Even Iranian guided missiles of medium range remain infinitely cheaper than the interceptors deployed to neutralize them. The mathematics is implacable and needs no ideological dressing to speak for itself. If 100 rockets are fired at $2,000 apiece, the attacker spends $200,000. If the defender intercepts 50 at $75,000 apiece, they spend $75 million for each salvo for each day of war. The progressive economic exhaustion of missile defense is inscribed in the very structure of the cost ratio between attack and interception, and no technology, however sophisticated, can change this arithmetic reality over time. The strategy that Iran deployed against Israeli defensive systems from February 28th was not born of tactical improvisation. It is the fruit of 2 decades of methodical intelligence accumulated with the patience that only an organization that knows it is in this for the long term can maintain. While Western analysts debated the invincibility of Israeli anti-missile architecture in their conferences and articles, the engineers of the Revolutionary Guards, the intelligence officers of the Pasteur and Corps, the specialists in electronic countermeasures trained in Iranian universities and perfected during joint exercises with Moscow. All these people worked on a much more practical and much more precise question. How exactly can this system be made to fail? How many simultaneous rockets suffice to saturate a battery? From which azimuths at what altitude? With what mixture of high ballistic trajectory and ground skimming drones to confuse the radars? These questions had answers, and the answers were translated into operational doctrine. The specific vulnerability of radars and batteries themselves as priority targets, which led to the emergency displacement of Tha'ad from South Korea, reveals a profound understanding of the value chain of the adversary's defensive system. A damaged radar does not only render the battery it serves blind, it widens the coverage sector of neighboring batteries that must compensate, lengthening their surveillance angles at the expense of precision. 2 batteries whose radars are degraded create a hole in the defensive fabric that may not be detectable from the ground until a rocket passes through it. This is exactly what Harrow describes under the modest term of hole in the early warning system. It is not a technical malfunction. It is the predictable result of a degradation strategy whose conception goes back years and whose execution began from the first hours of February 28th. There is a particularly cruel irony in the fact that it is precisely the Israeli obsession with technological superiority that created the conditions for this vulnerability. By betting everything on the anti-missile shield, by building an entire defensive doctrine around it, by presenting it as the definitive answer to rocket threats, Israel, in fact, simplified the work of its adversaries. It told them, here is what will stop you. It gave them 20 years to study how to circumvent it. And when Iran and Hezbollah finally deployed their response, it was precise, coherent, and terribly effective. The lesson is not that defensive technology is useless. It is that any system, however sophisticated, can be made to fail by an adversary who has had the time and intelligence to map its limits. And that excessive confidence in a single shield presented as an absolute guarantee creates a psychological fragility proportional to the idea one had formed of it. What this war reveals about the balance of power between technological might and strategic resilience is a lesson that military history has taught every generation, and that every generation seems constrained to relearn at its expense. Iran does not possess a tenth of the conventional military means of the United States or Israel. It has no aircraft carrier, no stealth bomber, no military satellites in sufficient numbers, no precision guidance systems comparable to those of its adversaries. But it possesses something that neither aircraft carriers nor bombers can buy: time, doctrinal coherence, and the conviction that intelligent resistance can defeat raw power. 37 waves of missiles by the 12th day of a war that its enemies had planned to last 72 hours. A new supreme leader invested in less than 24 hours after the death of the previous one. And Hezbollah, buried by adversary propaganda, returning to life with 100 rockets, half of which traversed the shield of the world. The Iron Dome held its promise in the war for which it was designed, that against the Artis al-Hamas, rockets fired from Gaza in manageable quantities. It did not hold the promise that its promoters had imprudently generalized to the entirety of threats that Israel might face. That of a territory impermeable to any ballistic attack, regardless of its origin, sophistication, and volume. The difference between these two promises is precisely the measure of the vulnerability revealed since February 28th. And this vulnerability documented in the 9,000 claims of the Jerusalem Post visible in the nocturnal images of northern Israel under Hezbollah rockets, analyzed with unusual frankness by Haaretz, will not be erased by the victory communiques that will continue to be published. It will remain in Iranian, Lebanese, and even Israeli memories as the moment when the magic of the perfect shield showed its seams. I want to hear your thoughts on the failure of the Iron Dome against coordinated Iranian and Hezbollah attacks. Do you believe Israel can develop countermeasures to saturation tactics, or has the fundamental vulnerability been permanently exposed? What does it mean when the most celebrated defense system in the world is proven inadequate? Drop your comments below. The human and demographic dimension of this war inside Israel is what international media discuss least, because it is less spectacular than images of explosions and missiles, but it may be the most revealing of the real effect of the conflict on Israeli society. Tens of thousands of people have left Israel since the beginning of hostilities, some temporarily, others with less certain intentions of returning. Entire families who are not particularly attached to Greater Israel projects or to the messianic convictions of the government coalition. Ordinary people who have children, apartments, cars, and who have calculated that spending several nights per week in a shelter hearing sirens sound in Tel Aviv, Bnei Brak, and Rishon LeZion, knowing that their building or vehicle may figure in the statistics of 9,000 claims. This is not the life they had envisioned in this country. The founding argument of Israel, which can be summarized as the idea that it must be a haven of security for Jews worldwide, suffers when the population of this haven itself begins to vote with its feet, vote with the civilization that has endured for 2,700 years, that patiently built the capabilities to expose the limits of the most celebrated defensive technology in modern history, has demonstrated once again that intelligence and determination can triumph over raw power. The missiles that continue to fly from Iranian territory, the rockets that Hezbollah launches from Lebanon, the coordination between these forces that Western analysts refuse to acknowledge. All of this represents the vindication of Iranian strategic patience and the failure of Israeli assumptions. The implications for American defense exports and alliance relationships extend far beyond this immediate conflict. The Iron Dome was not merely an Israeli system, but an American-funded showcase for missile defense technology that Washington has promoted worldwide. Gulf states purchased similar systems believing they were acquiring invulnerability. Asian allies calculated their security based on the promise that American technology could defeat any missile threat. What happens to that market, to those calculations, to that confidence when footage circulates globally of Iranian and Hezbollah rockets penetrating the world's most celebrated defense? The broader lesson for military planners worldwide is that no defensive system, regardless of sophistication or cost, provides absolute protection against a determined adversary with time to study its vulnerabilities. The offense-defense balance that theorists debate in academic journals has been settled empirically in the skies over Israel. Attackers with relatively inexpensive weapons can overwhelm defenders relying on expensive interceptors. Saturation tactics work. Preliminary degradation of defensive infrastructure works. And the combination of these approaches, executed with coordination between multiple actors attacking from different directions, creates challenges that even the most advanced technology cannot meet. The response that Israel is preparing a ground invasion of Lebanon with explicit statements from government-connected commentators about permanent expulsion of the population reveals the desperation that the failure of the technological shield has produced. When the defensive barrier falls, what remains are options that are more violent, more costly, and more likely to generate the endless cycle of grievance and retaliation that has characterized this region for decades. The crack in the Iron Dome may produce consequences far beyond the immediate military situation. The myth of invulnerability has cracked, and cracks once visible do not close by themselves. An American journalist, present at the moment of the March 11th attack, formulated it with a precision worth all the technical analyses. Now that Hezbollah knows how many simultaneous rockets are necessary to saturate the Iron Dome, that number will no longer remain a secret. And in a war where psychology is as decisive as ballistics, the partial dissipation of the shield's magic has a strategic value that neither Tahal press points nor Netanyahu speeches can entirely compensate. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand why the strategic calculations in the Middle East have fundamentally changed. I'm Michael Harris. The Iron Dome, the technological marvel that was supposed to render Israel invulnerable, has been exposed as inadequate against the coordinated assault that Iran and Hezbollah have unleashed. 50% of rockets getting through is not a minor malfunction. It is the revelation that the entire defensive doctrine built around this system was based on assumptions that Iran spent 20 years learning how to invalidate. The mathematics of asymmetric warfare favors the attacker. The patience of Iranian preparation has been rewarded, and the shield that was supposed to protect Israel has proven to be exactly what its critics always suspected: effective against limited threats, overwhelmed against serious ones. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and understand that what happened on March 11th marks the moment when the myth of Israeli defensive invincibility died under a rain of rockets that no technology could stop. I'll see you in the next video.